4 o'clock, right on the dot, so we might make a start. I'm hoping this only takes 15 minutes. So once again, this is an English lesson that I hope will only take 15 minutes. I'm trying to keep these 15 minutes max. This one's on advanced punctuation. I'm actually going to move me up here because I've actually designed these this way now. Okay. So, your learning intention for today is that you will be able to be that know-it-all who can tell people when they're using a semicolon incorrectly. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of all punctuation, particularly commas, semicolons, and colons, because that's what we're focusing on. There's a bunch of punctuation that I'll get to at the very end that we won't really go into depth on. That will probably be homework. So let's make a start. So the first 3 forms of punctuation are ones that we're all pretty familiar with and no one really has any issues with them. So periods or full stops, used at the ends of declarative statements, ends of abbreviations, e.g. Mr. Question marks, ends of a question. What did you do today? Question mark. Exclamation mark, end of an emphatic statement. I like your glasses very much. That kind of thing. Okay. This is where it gets. This is where we get to the meat. So sentence middles. The first one that we'll look at is a comma. Commas can be used in 3 different ways, and unfortunately, they're not often. Those 3 different ways aren't often taught separately. You probably get taught the second one here, separating an independent and dependent clause in a complex sentence. But that requires someone to have taught you what an independent and a dependent clause is, and they kind of just teach you. They teach you by telling you when you're using it wrong, rather than telling you what the correct use is. The second one you often get taught is lists. So, first of all, direct address. Thanks for that, Faris. Simple, easy use of a comma. The second one, separating an independent and dependent clause in a complex sentence. Now, if you don't know what a complex sentence is, I've actually, that's not meant to be there, give me a sec. So if you're not familiar with what a complex sentence is, then go back to my YouTube channel, look at the first isolation English lesson. That'll teach you what an independent and a dependent clause is and what a complex sentence is. So, Faris went to the market even though it was dangerous because he ran out of food. Now, because he ran out of food is a dependent clause. Faris went to the market is an independent clause, even though it was dangerous, also a dependent clause. So these second 2 are dependent clauses. What you'll notice is that if you were to take out the 2 commas and the bit in between the 2 commas, so if you were to take out even though it was dangerous, that sentence would still be a complete sentence. Faris went to the market because he ran out of food. That would be a complete sentence. It would be a compound sentence. Yes, it would be a compound sentence because would be taken out. No, because would be the conjunction. So actually, he ran out of food is a independent clause, even though I just said it was a dependent clause. My mistake. So, Faris went to the market, he ran out of food. Both of those are independent clauses, even though it was dangerous is a dependent clause. So, take out that middle bit, still makes sense. That would be a compound sentence. The general rule here is if you're ever in doubt, only ever use 2 commas per sentence. So you only ever want a sentence structure that looks like this, where you've got 2 commas with an with a dependent clause in between those 2 commas. And then if you were to take those commas out and the bit in the middle of the commas out, you would still be left with a complete sentence. So if you can read it, Faris went to the market because he ran out of food, and it still makes sense, then that's a good sentence. You don't want to have more than 2 commas because that's when you start getting run-on sentences. They might be technically grammatically correct, but it's bad writing. So, lists is the last one, fairly simple. Jasmine, Jackie, Johnny, and Jason all had a lovely time at the party. You'll notice that I've got a comma here. That was what that circle I deleted before was. I've obviously not put it back in the right place. So this one here, that is the Oxford comma. You might hear people talk about the Oxford comma. Basically, it just says, I went to a very good school. It is... I actually think that this is a huge, ongoing debate. I actually think that it's technically, grammatically incorrect to use an Oxford comma, but I'm wrong, basically. According to Oxford, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, according to everyone. So I was taught early on that it's completely unnecessary and don't put it in. You can put it in if you choose to. I think it looks a bit messy because you've got the and there. Basically, if you've got an and there, you don't really need the comma. Moving on. Okay, the second one we'll look at before we take a question break is the colon. So, colons can be used for 3 different reasons. The first one is setting up a category. So, there are 6 ways to skin a cat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's setting up a category and then a list, basically, that fits within that category. The second use is similar, but it's slightly different. So you might see this more in creative writing. There was one thing in the world that she loved more than any other, her cat. So that is a category for emphasis. It's not a technical category. It's not a category that sets up a list. It is really just a category within a creative writing sentence that you use to set up a category for emphasis. So you could actually use other punctuation there, but we'll leave it at that. So categories for emphasis is the second use. The third use is between 2 independent clauses when the second explains the first. So you could also use a semicolon here, but we'll look at that in a second. I would actually say in this sentence in particular, the colon is more accurate, and that's just a matter of degrees, but I would say that it is more accurate in this sentence. So I didn't have time to change. I was already late. That is 2 independent clauses. You could make a compound sentence out of it. So you could say, I didn't have any time to change because I was already late. That would be a compound sentence, 2 independent clauses joined with a conjunction, so because. However, you can also use a colon here. I didn't have time to change. I was already late. So, we'll stop there for a second. Take a moment to think of any questions you may have and ask it in chat, or ping me on Twitter at DanUcube. I'm not actually sure about mathematical category theory. However, to define a category, basically just anything that fits into one descriptor. So if you're setting up a category, let me go back to the slide. If you're setting up a category, the category is ways to skin a cat. You list the ways in which you can skin a cat. Other categories might be I don't know, primary colors. There are however many primary colors, blue, green, etc., etc. That's a category. The other things, the way that that's related to a category for emphasis is essentially you can use that idea in a creative way, right? So you can say, like I've said here, there is one thing in the world. Yeah, essentially, label, yep, set of terms. Yep, that's exactly it, Vinny. So, there is one thing in the world that she loved more than any other, her cat. That would be setting up a category, things in the world that she loves more than any other, and then the list in that category may only be one item long, but it is her cat. So that's a category. Next question from Amy. Hey Dan, with the categories for emphasis colon use, would it be preferable to use a dash? You can. I will get to that in a second. We're going to use a dash in the next section. So I'll leave that question for now. Cool. I think that's all the questions so far. Let me just check Twitter quickly. Should have this open already. Okay, no questions on Twitter. Awesome. Let's keep moving. So I will get back to dashes. Okay, so semicolons. The first use for a semicolon, this causes a lot of confusion for people. Actually, let me. I'm gonna have to keep moving myself around. That's fine. Semicolons are used to separate two independent clauses in a compound sentence. Now, you can use, as we've just sort of talked about with commas, you can use commas sort of to do this as well. And you can also use colons. However, this is just a stylistic choice. This is about relationships and how close you want things to look, basically, on the page. So, for example, Faris was hurt. He knew John only said it to upset him. That would be an example of where I'd use a semicolon. The rice was too hot. It burned Faris's mouth when he tried to eat it. Both of these sentences show two independent clauses. So he knew John had only said it to upset him would be an independent clause. Faris was hurt, independent clause. However, you want to show that there's a close relationship between those two things happening, right? So those two independent clauses are very, very related because Faris was hurt as a direct result of John saying something to upset him. So you've used a semicolon, and that kind of somehow denotes, I guess the creators of the English language decided that somehow connotes a very close relationship between those two independent clauses. The rice was too hot. It burned Faris's mouth when he tried to eat it. Obviously, those are two independent clauses that could work separately. You could have them in different sentences as simple sentences. So you could say, the rice was too hot, full stop. It burned Faris's mouth when he tried to eat it, full stop. However, that would be less correct than using a semicolon because the second sentence is as a direct result of the first sentence. And so if you don't already have run-on sentences, you might as well join those two things together and use a semicolon. Hopefully that makes sense. Thanks for the follow. Okay, so complex lists is the second use of a semicolon. Thank you, Adas. Okay, complex lists are the second use of a semicolon. There are many ways to ask for permission, including but not limited to. Set up the category with a colon, and then you get into your complex list. So a complex list, so we're starting here. I might have to turn those off for now. Yeah, there we go. Thanks for the follows. Appreciate it. Hopefully this is useful. We're going to keep going with the lesson. So complex lists, you set up the category. So there are many ways to ask for permission, including but not limited to. This category is ways to ask for permission, right? Your complex list is a list that requires more than one word per item in that list or has punctuation within that list. So, for example, verbal communication, non-verbal communication, both of those are items in a list that require more than one word to describe them, so you could justify using a semicolon to separate them. Writing a letter, or even in some cultures, a simple bow. Now that required commas because there's dependent clauses in there and independent clauses in there. So it's far too complex to just have commas separating the items in the list back here, because once you get to here and you're using commas, is this a new item in the list? No, it's one item in the list separated by a semicolon. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of semicolons. So this one is a little easier to get your head around. This first one, separating two independent clauses in a compound sentence that are related, that is sort of your primary bread and butter use of a semicolon. Hopefully that's clear. Your next one, this is when we're coming to dashes. So hopefully this answers your question. If it doesn't, I'll come back to your question. So a dash can be used for two reasons. So the first one is the most common, and you'll see this all over the place: relationships and ranges, so 1920 to 1927, or a relationship, so that would be a range, 1920 to 1927. A relationship is the Mandra-Perth train, right? So that's a relationship between two different places. You combine them with a dash. How that use up here is called an en dash. So if you're interested in the linguistics terms, it's called an en dash. You'll notice it is quite a bit shorter in length than this dash, which is an em dash. The second use, using an em dash, is to replace a comma, parenthesis, or colon for effect. So Amy, your question, she gave him her answer dash no. Again, stylistic choice. Completely up to you. Both are completely, perfectly acceptable. It's just about your preference. And what it often comes down to is basically just how many books you've read and what your favorite authors use. That's generally what people use. Both are completely acceptable. Now, the other thing that we might mistake for a dash is actually called a hyphen. This is when you hyphenate two or more words together into a compound term. So back to back, for example, or front to back, or any of those terms that you need to use multiple words, but it is just one thing. It is one term. You'll also see this with proper nouns. So I mean, arguably, even the Mandra-Perth train would be, you could argue that that is a hyphen. Yeah, so hopefully that's clear. It doesn't really matter whether or not whether you call it a hyphen or a dash, but, you know, if we're going to get pedantic about it, that's what it is. So, again, take a moment to think of a question you may have, ask it in chat, or ping me on Twitter. I've got Twitter open now. And yeah, I'll play some isolation for you again, mute my mic, and you can ask me any questions you have. Not really a question, more of a comment. I feel that the most of the punctuation here sits in the realm of stylistic choice rather than right or wrong. You're absolutely correct, but there are wrong ways to use each of these, right? So basically, if you sit outside of the rules of a semicolon, you will get pinged for it. If you're submitting this to, like, you know, wherever, if you're submitting an assignment, for example, or you're writing copy for a website or whatever it may be, and you're using a semicolon where you should be using a comma, because there are specific rules, right? So, for example, if I used a comma here, even, Faris was hurt, comma, he knew John had only said it to upset him, that would be less correct. I don't think it would be completely incorrect, but it would be less correct. And certainly if you were to use a semicolon in place of a comma, so if we go back to here, for example, and I said, thanks for that, semicolon, Faris, that's completely incorrect. Faris went to the market, semicolon, even though it was dangerous, semicolon, because he ran out of food. That would be very incorrect, because you're putting semicolons in front of dependent clauses, and semicolons aren't for that. So it is tricky. But yeah, absolutely. If it's about compliance, generally stick to simple English. Don't even bother with semicolons. Most people, a lot of writers literally write novels, even, huge, long, creative novels, and they don't use a single semicolon, just because it's a bugbear. Also, it draws attention, right? So if you use a semicolon, people are looking to figure out if you've used it right or wrong, or correctly or incorrectly. And You just don't want to draw that heat, I suppose. But it is useful to know, and you do look incredibly intelligent if you do use it correctly. Now, lesson's almost over. I just wanted to draw your attention to these. There are actually 14 punctuation marks in the English language. I'm pretty sure these are all the other ones. Does that sound right? So how many are there? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. No, I've actually missed some. But there are 14 punctuation marks in the English language. These are sort of the ones that I remembered when I was making these slides. Brackets, braces, parentheses, ellipsis, quotation marks, and apostrophes. I'm going to quickly go through these. The one that I kind of wish I had more time for would be apostrophe, because you see it like used incorrectly so often on street signs and all sorts of things, like business signs. But an apostrophe, I haven't even put it in there. Look at that. An apostrophe is most commonly used before or after an S to connote ownership, right? It's also used in abbreviations, obviously. The one that everyone gets real bent out of shape about is there, THEY apostrophe RE. They are. If you were to separate those two words, they are, but joining them together with an apostrophe, you can abbreviate it to there. That's the most common use. The second most common use would be for ownership. So it was Smithers Apple. So if the surname, or if the name of the person who you're showing the ownership of has an S at the end of their name, put the apostrophe after the S. If they don't have an S at the end of their name, put the apostrophe after their S and do not add a second S. If they don't have an S at the end of their name, put the apostrophe before the S that you are adding. Quotation marks, obviously, for a quotation. There's a whole bunch of rules with this. So let me add this here. So I don't know why these nouns are coming to mind, but there we go. Now, this is correct use of quotation marks. You've got a comma before he said before continuing, because this is the narrator speaking, and then the end of the quotation, and grapes. Obviously, Mr. Man, before saying I like candles and during his speech on candles and grapes, he didn't stop to say he said before continuing. He just said I like candles and grapes, but you've split it up, you've added some narration in there. He said before continuing, which means that you need to add punctuation around that. We're not going to get too much more into that. If you want to look that up, go ahead. Ellipses, it's only 3 dots. 3 dots and 3 dots alone. Do not add like 7 dots. It doesn't make any sense. That is 1 punctuation mark, the ellipses. Parentheses, braces, brackets. Now, brackets aren't really used that much in English. They're mostly used in mathematical equations. I don't actually know what the use for brackets are, really, because I've never really seen them used. Braces are used to join items in a category, so you'll often see, I won't try and do it on here, but you'll often see a list of things and then the brace here, and then I'm doing that backwards for you guys. So the list of things and then a brace here and then a category that those items belong to. Parentheses is the most common use in English language in terms of these 3. They're used for adding more information into a sentence, or citations is the main use. That's it. So if you want to continue to look into those things, feel free. They're just used, apostrophes are used quite often, but I figure everyone already kind of knows how to use them. But these ones, certainly, these top 4 aren't used that often, so I didn't think that it was worth covering them. Stay safe. I will hopefully see you next week. Probably I'll do Monday and Tuesday again. Please do apostrophe. Okay, I'll cover apostrophe in the next lesson, maybe next Monday, before we continue on to other things. Hopefully we'll do some more, like, I don't know, writing skills, that kind of thing. Maybe we'll try and come up... I've got this idea to try and come up with a collectively authored short story or something. That would be cool. Yeah, stay safe, keep out of public spaces, and I'll see you next week.